Well, hello, and welcome to the very first audio edition of Quick Shots at Thirsty Theology. We're not going to do this too often, but I thought it'd be kind of fun to mix it up and let you guys listen in rather than just reading through some of the stuff we're putting out there. So today I wanted to just chat about something real quick, something that's been in process for me for many years, but I feel like I'm coming to a point where I can really land on some conclusions, some important settlements on my position here, and that's really about the very nature of Jesus Christ as the incarnate Son of God. And kind of to give you a frame of reference, for most of Western church history, there's been this almost assumed, rarely explicit, but almost assumed concept that when Jesus took on humanity in the Incarnation, he did so with what we might call a pre-fall human nature. So kind of the human nature that Adam started out with before he bit into the apple, before the fall took place, and so it's kind of untainted. And so in that sense, Jesus kind of takes on almost a perfect humanity, and sin is always around him and tugging at him from the outside, but there's nothing inside that is really experiencing the result of sin other than maybe like the decay of the body. But within the natural, that nature, he's kind of not having to deal with that. And to me, that has always been a really confusing thing as I started to study theology, as I started to look at who Jesus was and press into the atonement, because so much of Western theology also suggests that it is our very nature that condemns us. That's why we talk about total depravity in Reformed circles, right? This idea that inherently from the moment we're born, we are deserving of separation from God. And so all we can do is put our faith in Jesus Christ to rectify that. But if all Jesus can do is rectify like the decay of our bodies and maybe the sins that we commit of commission and omission, like these external actions and thoughts and attitudes, but he cannot actually heal our nature because that's not something he ever touches, then doesn't that leave a part of our condition unredeemed? And so there was a famous theologian back in the 400s BC. His name was Gregory, AD, not BC. His name was Gregory Nazianzus. And he coined this phrase that has just kind of echoed throughout the centuries, and people have taken it and used it at various times, but it is that the unassumed is the unredeemed. And that kind of takes this concept and really puts it into a piece of tweetable theology. But the idea is that whatever Christ does not assume in his incarnation, whatever he does not lay on his very being, stays unredeemed. He has to enter so far, so deep, so intimately into our condition that it becomes his own condition, that in essence he becomes condemned for us. Now that's not to suggest that he has committed any sin, just the opposite. He takes on our condition in such a way as to transform it at every moment of every second, even though he takes what we might call a post-fall nature into his incarnation, that at no moment does he give into its luring, drawing, attacking nature, its destructive bent. He is always and at every moment kind of rebending the will of the nature into line with the will of the Father. And so for me, this has been extremely important to understand that it's not just the actions that I commit day to day that have been redeemed and taken care of, but it's my very nature, the very core of my being who is redeemed. There is no part of my experience, there is no part of my existence that is untouched by the very incarnate Son of God, by the atonement with which he secured for me. And so for those of you who might be thinking, okay, yeah, that sounds really great, but what about the Bible? Definitely. A couple of things. First of all, a very introductory class on sin might take you to the book of James, where it talks about the progression of sin. And it talks there that sin is kind of like this lure, and when it is full, like it pulls at you from within, and when it is fully grown, then comes death. And so the concept that Jesus never had a lure within him towards something other than what God had intended for him would be to suggest that he never really experienced sin to its fullest. And so then how could he understand as a sympathetic high priest, or how could he redeem those moments when we feel that pull, that tug that seems illogical, crazy even? But because he did take on the fullness of our experience, then even he understood and felt at times when Satan was in the desert with him, tempting him. Like, did Jesus have any draw to respond to Satan's prompts? Was it ever like a thought for even a split second that, man, that does kind of sound good? And of course, we're kind of going out into some deeper water here. The scriptures don't explicitly say that, but we're taking kind of the overarching message of what scripture does say and saying, okay, Jesus had to have at some point felt that sense that that does look good, but in every moment saying, but it is not worth it, because it is not my Father's will. And so even in so doing, he takes the very process of temptation and turns it into one of restoration, which is such a beautiful thing. Hebrews chapter 2 is also a really important passage for this concept. And of course, Hebrews chapter 2 kind of is setting up this long story about how Jesus is supreme, how Jesus is the foremost high priest, he is the firstborn of all creation, and so on and so forth. But the author felt it was really important in chapter 2 at the very outset to start talking about what Jesus accomplished, not just in his death, but particularly in the Incarnation. Hebrews 2 starting in verse 14 says, "Therefore, since the children share in blood and flesh, he also in like manner shared in these same things, in order that through death he could destroy the one who has the power of death, that is, the devil, and could set free those who through fear of death were subject to slavery throughout all their lives. For surely he is not concerned with angels, but he is concerned with the descendants of Abraham. Therefore, he was obligated to be made like his brothers in all respects, in order that he could become a merciful and faithful high priest in the things relating to God, in order to make atonement for the sins of the people." And so that passage just very clearly is trying to give us language to understand the depth of the reality of the Incarnation. A couple of key phrases there: that he shared in these same things, referencing the flesh and blood that we have. And then in verse 17, that he was obligated to be made like his brothers in all respects. And so that just kind of, again, points to the depth in which he took on our predicament that he might heal it. Another passage that I think is really important comes from Romans chapter 8. And we all know Romans chapter 8 because there is so much like gold packed into that chapter. But we tend to jump to the very end of the chapter where it talks about how heights and depths and angels and demons and past and present and future cannot keep us from the love of God. or that he works all things together for those who love him, for the good of those who love him. Or how about the passage that says, if he is not against us, or if he is for us, who can be against us? We know these verses. We get them tattooed, and we get them written in our note cards, and leave them up on our desks to feel empowered. But those things could not be real, could not be in place if it wasn't for how Paul begins the chapter, setting it up as an understanding of where it all began. So in chapter 8, even starting in verse 3, you can go earlier, but just to make it easy, for God has done what the law, weakened by the flesh, could not do, by sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and for sin he condemned sin in the flesh, in order that the righteous requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us, who walk not according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. And so even right there, Paul is trying to take this concept of the flesh, that evil, that worldly, that self-serving, that kind of false ego that we all carry around with us. It was that very flesh that Jesus took on, that weakened flesh, so that he might fulfill the righteous requirement of the law and be able to redeem us. And so all of that is just kind of a quick look at a much bigger topic and a bigger conversation. But just to say, this is something that I've been working on, thinking through, processing for years now, and feel like at this point in my journey, in my walk with Jesus Christ, I have good reason to think that when Jesus came, he didn't just come as a blank slate, pre-fall human who had no propensity towards sin. No, he took on the very worst of all of us, so that he could redeem the worst of all of us, so that there is no man, no woman, no situation, no corner of this earth that is devoid of that whisper, "Come to me. You are forgiven. I love you, and you are my child." And so I think that is a beautiful reflection, and I wanted to share that with you guys. Look forward to future audio recordings where I can share some of my thoughts, and hopefully this will get some good commentary and dialogue back and forth, either on the website or possibly on social media. Feel free to message me if you have any questions or other things that you'd love for us to talk about or dive into. That'd be great. Thanks so much. Until next time.
The podcast you just heard was recorded with Anchor. If you want to make your own, download the Android or iOS app completely free from anchor.fm/podcast. That's anchor.fm/podcast.